Good morning, class. Thank you for visiting my post. For this week's discussion post, I've decided to answer question number 5. The question asks, discuss the traditional role of conventional forces, including the debate over heavy and light forces. To begin, the traditional role of conventional forces were to be large enough and powerful enough to fight if there was a World War III in Europe. However, the end of the Cold War made this difficult and unlikely because no one has attempted to confront the United States in traditional symmetrical warfare since World War II and the end of the Cold War. What I mean by this traditional force structure is both sides fighting a stand-up Western-style warfare. And the war in Vietnam was one of the first times we saw this method shift from the traditional force structure because we needed to keep up with the methods of the Viet Cong. For example, American soldiers had to adjust not seeing their enemy face to face because of the jungle terrain and the shift of weapons like using napalm. We have seen this transition from symmetrical warfare to asymmetrical warfare with also fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan. To understand the debates over heavy and light forces, we must first understand the difference between the two. Heavy forces is the conventional model, meaning World War II and having a military that is heavily armed, large units, mobile mechanized units against a similar configured opponent. So your opponent was using the same type of warfare as you were. For instance, sometimes the same weapons, fighting in more conventional ways of direct contact and those type of things. Also, land, air, and naval warfare were pretty much the same on both sides. One side may have a stronger navy, but they are both still using the same type of forces. So also more specific are heavy tanks, large ships, and heavy artillery. And these are designed to fight conventional warfare with the mission of destroying the enemy. Conventional warfare typically deals with overthrowing a government, like Germany during World War II. However, with unconventional warfare, more specifically the war in Afghanistan, the United States is not trying to overthrow the government, but get rid of a group that resides in the area, like the Taliban. So light forces deals with not engaging in direct contact between armies, navies, and air forces. Less mobile forces seeing compact. There is a de-emphasis on large military equipment and an emphasis on speed, maneuverability, and surprise. So some examples of the light forces model are the special forces and the rangers, which are designated groups that go quickly into a specific location to do whatever job needs to quickly be done and leave as soon as possible. The idea of less fighting and interaction with the enemy is also seen in this type of model, focusing on a smaller group instead of a larger group because less lives can sometimes be lost and less equipment is needed with fewer people. So those were the two differences between the light forces and the heavy forces. So this principle of conventional warfare has dominated the way the American military works since the American Civil War. However, the shift from conventional to unconventional has taken place in only a few short years, which can prove to be difficult to make the transition as the United States learns about new types of asymmetrical warfare, like new weapons that are being established, like IEDs and drones. However, what will the future be like as we debate the use of the conventional model versus the unconventional model? So many believe we will continue on the path of the unconventional model because the prospect of fighting a symmetrical warfare against heavy forces using conventional methods have seemed to disappear. And then, for example, our enemies are transitioning to using asymmetrical warfare. So the United States either continues on the traditional ways and falls behind the capabilities of the enemy, or we drop our conventional methods used since the Civil War and we um, try to use the same methods as our enemies or advance our methods to step in front of our enemies and ultimately be in front of them and have better uses of warfare than they do as we continue this battle of different uses of methods and all that type of things. So our reading this week mentions the QDR, which is a review of the American strategy and forces mandated by Congress once every 4 years. And this states the United States lacks a peer competitor or even an adversary that poses the kind of military threat for which those forces, for which the conventional types of forces and the heavy forces have been historically appropriate for. So therefore, the debate should be that we need to keep using light forces and the unconventional method to defeat our enemies and step ahead of the race. So the main issue of the debate, to sum it up, is do we keep using our conventional methods that we have used since the Civil War and that ultimately worked for decades and decades, or do we follow our enemies and do what our enemies are doing and switch to this unconventional model in order to keep up and try and stay ahead of what our enemies are doing? So I just want to hear maybe what some of your thoughts are, or if you believe we should stick with the conventional methods because they worked for so long and we should keep using them to try to adjust to the asymmetrical warfare, or should we switch to this unconventional model to try and keep up with what everybody else is doing? So thanks again for visiting my post, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.